Have you ever been out in the wilds of nature and then you've come across a gorgeous looking apple tree? It's full of apples. Reach up, you pick one off and you crunch into it and it's crunchy and it's juicy and it's delicious. And you just think, oh man, I wish I had that apple in my garden. Well, in this video about apple tree grafting, I'm going to show you exactly how you can do that. Apple tree grafting is the process of cutting a branch from an existing apple tree and attaching that to a different tree. And when the tree fuses together, so over time it heals, and if it's grafted properly, the tree that you cut will actually connect and fuse with the tree that you're planting on, and that will then grow to create a new apple tree. But here's the beauty of it, you see, when you're out in the wild, a lot of apple trees that you come across have just grown from the produce of people dropping seeds or throwing apple cores around, and every now and then you come across an apple tree that just is beautiful, it's gorgeous, it tastes delicious, just like the one that I found last autumn on a roadside not too far away from where I live, and it's a massive vigorous tree and the apples were about this big and they were just gorgeous. And they're still, actually, now we're in the end of February and I found this tree in September last year and the apples have stored all of that time in the garage. So yeah, when you come across a tree like that out in the wild, you can make a copy of that tree and then you can plant your own orchard in your garden. And the process we do that with is called apple tree grafting. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you actually do that, from cutting the scions or selecting the scions on the vigorous tree, your favorite tree out in the wild, and then essentially grafting them, gluing them onto a new tree, which in this case is what we call rootstocks. So what are rootstocks? What are scions? And how does this all fit together? Well, when we take a cutting from an apple tree out in the wild, we call that cutting a scion, S-C-I-O-N. It looks like this after you've cut it. It's a thin cutting of last year's growth. So it's new, fresh growth, so it's new wood, and it's about a pencil's width in diameter. When we cut this from the existing tree, this is what we call the scion. Now this particular scion could be cut in several places, 1, 2, so give you 3, you get 3 possible trees, maybe 2 because we'd leave that thin bit, but we could cut it here and that would give us 2 possible new apple trees from this one scion. Now once you have the cutting, and I'll show you how to do that with the correct tools in a minute. You don't need correct tools, you can use just a grafting knife. A normal grafting knife will do, in fact any garden knife will do, and you can make your cuttings that way. It's just easier if you have a specific tool, something like this, which I'll show you in close as we go through the process. But this is a specific apple tree grafting tool and it cuts the wood in specific ways that make it easy to join them together. So when you have your cutting from the tree you found out in the wild, you then need to fuse that or join that to an existing apple tree. Now you could put that scion cutting into an existing apple tree that you've already got growing in your garden. You just need to cut off a part of the branch of your existing tree and then attach the scion to that tree, and then over the next year, once that branch is fused together, the new scion cutting will actually grow the identical apple that was on the tree where you cut it from, even if the tree that it's grafted onto, the one planted in your garden, is a different tree. And this is when we have what's known as rootstocks. So some apple trees are more resistant to disease in your area. So if you find an apple tree that's particularly vigorous out and about around where you live, that tree has acclimatized to your area and is disease resistant and is managing to survive. You know, it's not weak, it's not falling over, and it's able to survive fit and well out in the wild. So whatever it is growing from, it is a good tree to graft onto. Now what you usually find though when you're out and about are that most of the types of apples you come across in the wild, we describe them in the UK as crab apples, because the tree is nice and big and vigorous, but the apples are only about that big that grow on them. And that's because the genetics for that from that seed or whatever has grown that tree aren't the vigorous, big, juicy kinds of apples that we see in the store. But the tree itself, the roots are strong. it would be amazing if we could graft this beautiful tasty apple onto this tree. And that's basically what has happened commercially, and what we now have is a market where we can buy what's called rootstocks. So you'll see in the picture that I'm throwing over here now, these are M26 apple tree rootstocks. Now there are various different kinds of rootstocks. They have different properties. So the M26 in particular, I chose for my garden because it only grows to about 3 meters high. So some of the other rootstocks grow to 6 meters high. They are particularly vigorous. They have, you know, wider roots. So I've got a bag of M26 apple tree rootstocks, and you'll see in the rootstock that it's basically a 2-year-old rootstock. So the root stock has been growing in soil cultivated commercially, in this case at an organic garden, for 2 years. And at about 2 years, the width of the trunk of the rootstock is about the same width as a pencil in your scion cutting. So after 2 years of growth, your rootstock grows to be about the same width as these cuttings that we take, and that's why we take them at that time with that width, because when you graft the apple tree together, it must match specifically the width of the rootstock, so that the little green layer just inside the bark, known as the cambium layer, that must line up and match exactly to the rootstock. If you can match the scion exactly to the rootstock, so the cambium layer is aligned, and then you wrap that up in grafting tape, you should get a perfect graft. And you will know if you've got a perfect graft because, you know, the wound will heal and you'll get fresh buds and fresh leaves coming out of the scion over the course of the next year. So when's the best time to do your apple tree grafting? Well, the best time to take cuttings from existing apple trees is in the winter, when the tree itself goes into hibernation. So the leaves have all fallen off and the tree stores that energy. It sends that energy down into the roots, and the tree is bare. At that point, the tree is effectively asleep for the winter, saving all of its energy for the next year. That's when you need to cut your scions. In the UK, that's typically between, I don't know, December and February. So somewhere between then, when it's, you know, most cold and frosty, that's a good time. If you take your cuttings then, you can then bring them home, stick them in a plastic bag, put a slightly damp paper towel in the plastic bag with them, seal the bag, wrap it up, and then store it somewhere dark. If you store it somewhere dark for a few months, then it will last. The wood will survive, and when we get to spring, so early March or end of February, so we're in end of February now, end of February, early March is when you can take those scion cuttings out of your bag and start grafting them onto rootstocks. When spring comes around, it's time to graft those scions onto the rootstocks. Now, I buy my rootstocks from an organic nursery. I prefer organic ones just because I prefer to do things that way. I would love to grow my own, but I don't have enough space to grow my own rootstocks just yet. But once you've got your rootstocks, you need to have some containers to put them in. I use usually fleece fabric or air pot containers, which act to prune the roots as they grow. They encourage healthy root growth, because as the root grows inside the fabric pot or the air pot, when the root touches the side of that fabric pot, the root comes in contact with air, either air in the air pot, and then cuts off that root at that point and encourages fresh root growth, or in the case of a fabric pot, when it reaches the fleece fabric of the pot, it then stops growing and it encourages more root growth. The idea behind that is when you come around to planting your tree in a year's time or 2 years' time in the final location where it's going to be, when you pull it out of those fabric pots or air pots that are encouraging root growth, you'll get a big healthy root ball, and that then is a good sign of it being a healthy tree and should hopefully take wherever you plant it. So in the spring, you've got all of your rootstocks, and you take your grafts and you then graft your fresh scion cutting to the rootstock. Once you've made your perfect cut, you then attach the scion to your rootstock, and You nip it tight together, make sure the thin green cambium layer is lined up exactly with the rootstock so that it's almost a perfect match. The other thing to notice when you are grafting your scion is make your grafting cut just beneath a bud where a bud was growing, because that will then encourage energy into the graft. It will draw, the scion will draw energy into that bud and will help the wound or the graft cut fuse and heal better and quicker. So always make your grafting cut just below a bud. Once you've joined the two together, the scion and the rootstock, you then need to gently wrap it with your grafting tape. The special tape for this, you don't want to wrap it too tight so that the branch doesn't have an opportunity to expand into the tape. So make sure you do buy grafting tape, a special grafting tape which has the ability to expand and keep moisture and dampness and rain out, so it helps the wound heal quicker. Again, I'll post links to specific grafting tape in the link section below. So once you've got your graft wrapped and taped up, now is the time to make sure it's maintained and cared for. Keep it out of direct sunlight, keep it in a nice out of heavy weather, obviously out of harsh conditions, in a nice temperate location, and water it well. If it's in a pot, usually it will be in a pot. I use 30-litre pots, 30-litre fabric pots or 30-litre air pots, and water it. Make sure it's looked after, and in about 3 months' time you should notice small buds emerging on your scion, and that's a sign that your graft is taken. And from there, well, then you just prune it and look after it as normal. That's pretty much all there is to it. Now, in a year's time, you should have an exact clone or copy of that beautiful, vigorous, delicious apple you found out in the wild. And if you're interested in buying any scion cuttings or even 2-year-old grafted apple trees that I've already prepared, then please check the website out, check the supplies section and look at trees. And you'll see a selection there of the things that I've grown. And I only ever share tasty stuff that I've personally looked after, and everything that I do is all natural and organic and as close to the way our ancient ancestors did things as I can possibly muster. So yeah, if you're interested in all of that, check it out. And of course, don't forget to check bornbright.com for any other information about self-sufficiency and things you can do to take responsibility over your life back into your own hands. And I'll see you in the next one.